We have achieved great things. We have made giant leaps. We've gone far beyond what we thought was possible. But we have only just begun. Our future in space is unlimited, and it will benefit all humanity. But it will take hard work, new technologies, advanced financing models, and enabling public policy. The Beyond Earth Institute is creating a policy and legal framework to enable the creation of economically vibrant communities beyond Earth. We will engage all stakeholders on critical policy issues: property rights in space, norms of behavior, conflict resolution protocols, filling the technology gaps, exploring new financing mechanisms, and making space settlement an agreed goal of the U.S. and its allies. Beyond Earth is committed to the true purpose of why we go to space. Join us on this journey.
Hi, everyone. Hello and welcome to this Beyond Earth webinar titled Sacred Skies, Integrating Diverse Spiritual Perspectives in Space Policy. My name is Steve Wolf, and I'm the president of the Beyond Earth Institute. Again, welcome. If I could ask you all to keep yourselves muted and your cameras off during the program, that would be much appreciated. And before I introduce this incredible program that we have for you today, I just have a few announcements I want to make. That we now have a date for the Beyond Earth Symposium 2024. This is our third installment. It's going to be on November 12th and 13th at the American University Washington College of Law in Washington, D.C. We are expecting this to really be even greater than our event last year. And please save the date and then look for more information as that comes up. We're getting very close to publication of the Beyond Earth Review. This is our policy journal that will offer articles and essays on critical policy and legal issues that relate to our mission, as you saw in our video. And next month, we will be launching the Beyond Earth Business Challenge. This is a business plan competition for startups and new companies whose business models support human spaceflight and human habitation. So this is an exciting program. If anyone who's entrepreneurs on this program, I encourage you to participate. And we look forward to initiating again this year the Leadership Council working groups on a variety of topics. These working groups last year created 3 complete reports and papers. So we're looking forward to a continuation of that thought process. The working groups this year are going to include commercial space stations, reliability, health, and safety, where we're going to focus on artificial gravity, an important technology that is completely underdeveloped. The cislunar economy working group, advanced financing strategies, how do we pay for it, right? And then a new one this year is going to be on large-scale habitats. And this is going to be exciting, where we start to say, how do we scale up habitats from 2 or a dozen individuals to ones that perhaps can support a population of 100 or 1,000. So it's exciting discussion. If any of you are interested in any of these activities, I encourage you to reach out to me. My email is very simple, steve@beyondearth.org. I'd love to hear from you on any of these. And again, I'd like to thank those of you who have chosen to donate through the registration process. Every dollar counts, so thank you so much for that. And now to our program. I've really been looking forward to this discussion today. As you know, space is a sacred place. I believe personally that putting our attention on the stars and on the planets is an uplifting experience and can even be transcendent. As we look to expand out beyond this earth, it is very important that we take into consideration the cultural, spiritual, and ethical issues of this process represents. We cannot expand into space and disregard the cultural and spiritual concerns, of course, and that's, but there, but there also is, how do we find the balance to our desire to expand into space against those issues and concerns of ethics and spirituality? And that's what we're going to consider in this very important webinar today. I want to welcome the Overview Roundtable who is joining us today in this call. The Overview Roundtable meets weekly at this very time, and they've chosen to use this time to tune in to our webinar. The Roundtable is run by Frank White, who's the author of The Overview Effect. Many of you should know him. He's been also a lifetime friend of mine, and we'll hear from Frank later on in the program. I'll now turn this program over to Lauren Andrade to introduce and to moderate the discussion. Lauren is a lawyer who holds a JD from the University of Hawaii William S. Richardson School of Law, is an LLM candidate at the Air and Space Law of the University of Mississippi. She is a legal consultant for Hive Group and teaches law at the University of Hawaii. Lauren also serves as Beyond Earth's Director of Marketing and Communications. Lauren has been involved with Beyond Earth for over 2 years and recently has joined us officially as part of our paid team. And she has just done tremendous work for us. She is a real rising star in the industry. So with that, Lauren, I'll turn the program over to you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all for joining us here today. As Steve said, I have had the privilege to work with Beyond Earth for going on 2 years, first as a research associate working closely with the Leadership Council working groups, and now as the Director of Marketing and Communications. In those years, I have seen Beyond Earth bring together a remarkable cadre of experts in a myriad of fields relating to space policy. And as a think tank, with the mission of enabling human migration into the solar system, Beyond Earth has really prided itself on opening spaces for great minds from all sectors to come together to discuss some of the most pressing issues humanity faces as we forge the path towards space migration. And in doing so, we have tackled quite a few topics, from human health and safety to policy considerations of human space migration to space nuclear technology, which we had a webinar on last month. One topic we have yet to tackle, though, is the role that culture and spirituality play in the development of space policy, and therefore also how humanity moves forward in space. In the recent years in particular, the commercial space industry is engaged in a diverse spectrum of ventures on the moon. Yet, as humans advance into outer space, we don't check what makes us human at the Kármán line. And by that, I mean that we continue to be grounded in the cultural norms and spiritual practices that we engage in on Earth. And we would thus be remiss not to open a dialogue surrounding the role that the diverse spiritual views of humanity plays in our path moving forward, and to address how those views can be best respected by upcoming space missions without also limiting the progress of the space industry. To get to the root of these issues, I am so thrilled to announce our fantastic selection of panelists today. We are joined by Michelle Hanlon, the founder and president of For All Moonkind, and also the executive director of the Center for Air and Space Law at the University of Mississippi. Dina Weibel, professor of anthropology at Grand Valley State University. Charlie Schaefer, chairman and CEO of Celestis, and Justin Augustine, executive director of the Navajo Nation Washington office. But before we get into this discussion and before I have a chance to have the panelists introduce themselves, I do want to remind everyone here today that it's my job to remain neutral and to open a space for a productive and respectful dialogue. This panel is going to be asked to discuss sensitive topics, and I would ask that we remain respectful and open-minded throughout our time here today. Now, you've heard me talk enough. That's not what you're here for. To get down to business in this discussion, I would like to first hear from each of our panelists about the path that you took to arrive here today. What has drawn you to this topic? What identity do you have that you are bringing to the table as you are addressing this topic? And how have you approached the role of culture and spirituality in space thus far? Dina, would you like to kick us off?
Sure. Thank you so much for that introduction, Lauren. And I'm really excited to be here and very grateful to be included. I'm Dina Weibel. I am a cultural anthropologist, and my area of research throughout nearly 30 years, maybe it's even more than that, has been the anthropology of religion. So I started out studying terrestrial sacred sites, mostly in Europe and North America. And then I was always interested in space and space exploration, but I made the very fortuitous move of marrying a former chief historian of the Johnson Space Center, and slowly over time got very much enmeshed in space culture as well. So by the time I became a full professor, I decided, this is really what I'm enjoying doing. I'm going to focus on religion and space. So since then, I've really been focusing on doing research mostly in the space professions. So astronomy work with people who are astronauts, engineers, looking at their religious beliefs and how those influence their work in space. But I'm also very much aware, as somebody who's been teaching anthropology of religion for many years, the variety of religions on Earth and sort of how those religions understand space as well. So I guess I'm coming with the identity of a professional anthropologist who's very interested in both space and religion.
Fantastic. Thank you, Dina. Justin, can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. Yahat she Justin Hastin Insha, Donet Nishlinigi Belagana Nishle, Kotsine Basashibalagana Edashe Nana Kisane Edasanele, but Oge the Dead Nasha. My name is Justin Ahostin, and I'm the Executive Director of the Navajo Nation Washington office. And in that capacity, I do have a professional responsibility to advocate for the cultural and policy interest of my nation's government, which includes protecting sacred sites just like the moon. But on a personal level, my grandfather was a medicine man, or what we refer to in the Navajo culture as an atatli, and he raised me in our traditional values and our traditional ways that go back to time immemorial, before a lot of the settlers first came to this part of the world. So our culture has a deep reverence for celestial bodies, which includes the moon. And I got into a lot of the discussions here very recently, but really being able to incorporate a lot of our indigenous knowledge into these discussions is something that I'm hoping to contribute to in the future. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Justin. Michelle, can you tell us a little bit about your background?
Michelle Hanlon. I'm the Executive Director of the Center for Air and Space Law, and the President and co-founder of For All Moonkind, the only organization in the world that's focused on protecting human heritage in outer space. First, I just have to note that I taught Lauren everything she knows. So, no, I'm kidding. She's a wonderful, wonderful LLM candidate, and we're just so proud of her and all that she's done and been able to do with her air and space law degree. So I come here with all my hats on. I'm a legal professional. I'm a space lawyer. I'm really passionate and enthusiastic about commercial space and supporting commercial space activities in any way that we can. But I'm also a little bit of a protectionist. I want to protect the boot prints on the moon. In my work with For All Moonkind, I've learned a lot about different cultures. We have lawyers and policymakers from all around the world, from every walk of life, and talking about what those boot prints mean to them. And seeing the different perspectives, I think, is just incredibly valuable. And so I'm just really delighted to be here in a position to help contribute to the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And last but not least, Charlie, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and the angle that you're approaching this from?
Yes, I succeeded to navigate the screen. Hello, everybody. My name's Charlie Schaefer. I started out as a child, as was once said, of the 50s, 60s, glued to the television set when every space mission lifted off. It was hard to describe for those of you who are not my age. That period of history was very special. Forgot about space entirely until I was a student at Georgetown University in the mid-70s. Ran across the work of Gerard K. O'Neill that taught humanity can and should expand throughout the solar system. Got interested in the social science aspects in many ways what we're discussing today, and was awarded the first ever NASA contract to write a book on the social science implications of space. So I have a little bit of a background, but then the entrepreneurial bug hit me in the 80s. I was fortunate to run the Washington office for Space Services Incorporated of America, which launched the first privately funded rocket into space in 1982. My job was to get 12 specific federal permissions, including a gun dealer's license, a waiver from model rocket regulations, and a State Department export license, because there was no FAA in 1981 and 1982. I co-founded Celestis in the mid-90s as we began to think, what markets are there out there that are for everybody or almost everybody? And instead of trying to appeal to a few government clients, we thought maybe there's a market for, particularly as alternative forms of memorial celebrations were just beginning, we thought maybe there was a market for that. Run that company for almost 30 years, 22 missions to date. And we deliver an amazing service, in my opinion, to people from all walks of life, all religions, all cultures. Choose us as an appropriate service.
Thank you so much, Charlie. One thing is that everybody on this panel has a bio that is way too long for us ever to really get everything. I invite you all to read more about them on the Beyond Earth website on the event page. Every single one of them has so many incredible credentials. But let's get into what we're all here for today. Dina, I have a question for you as an anthropologist. How has your approach to the cultural and spiritual importance of the moon in particular been complicated by differing viewpoints?
A lot of what anthropology focuses on are the wide range of viewpoints. In anthropology, we see humankind as a single unit. We're one species, but we're an incredibly diverse life form that's got so many different approaches to all aspects of culture. Culture is learned more than it is built in. And so that learning it over and over means that it's subject to change all the time. So when we look at the history of humans, first of all, the moon has always been there with humans. There's never been a time where there were humans and no moon. And so every single culture has been aware of the moon and very interested in the moon as this huge glowing circle that changes shape and takes different forms and is connected to humans biologically. I'm thinking about women's cycles, for instance. But it's so apparent that every single culture has something to say about the moon. So many cultures that we're familiar with in the Western culture, whatever you want to call it, Greco-Roman influenced culture, if we think back to those religions, certainly there were moon gods and moon goddesses that were considered to be on the moon or the moon themselves. You have other religions around the world that see the moon as a deity, as itself. Moon religions that also consider the moon to be the place where the souls of the dead go. So some forms of Hinduism, certainly some kind of ancient Lithuanian religions and Russian Slavic religious focus had the idea that when human beings die, their souls would temporarily go to the moon until they were called to the next thing, whether it was to reincarnate or to go to the permanent afterlife. I think one of the main things is that for the vast majority of human history, the moon was unreachable and stood as this sort of bright light in the sky that sort of we were drawn to but could never touch. And so symbolically, the moon has always sort of represented something apart from us and an unfulfilled desire until very, very, very recently in terms of human history. It's complicated because there's not a culture that doesn't have a view of the moon or an understanding of the moon. And because our cultures have come into contact in some cases or been, isolated from each other in others, there's not agreement. Even cultures that consider the moon to be sacred, what that means can be incredibly different from one society to another. And I don't have a clear answer. There's no one right answer because so much is involved and so many different groups have valid understandings. I do know, though, it's important to keep the spiritual understandings in mind because there's a tendency to dismiss those in some scientific endeavors, and the need to recognize that humans are humans are humans, and that religion and spirituality, even if some people want them to be separated from human activity, there really do seem to be something that we see throughout the world that is hard to separate from humanity. And I do believe that as humans go into space, religion is going to go into space. And so it's good we're having these conversations.
Absolutely. And to narrow in just a little bit on this idea of culture and spirituality and how it relates to the moon. In your recent article that you wrote for the Space Review, you had discussed concepts of purity and impurity and touchability and untouchability of sacred objects. And, if we're understanding the moon as a sacred object, can you expand upon this idea just a bit more before we jump forward?
Sure. I gave some examples in that article. Just because something is sacred does not tell us whether it is something that can have human contact or not. Once again, it's tremendously variable. I'll give you an example of the Torah, for example, in Judaism. A Torah is created, it's kosher, it's through kosher animal parts, the parchment, through the ink. Once you have a Torah, it is not to be touched by human hands. You do not turn the pages of the Torah or the scroll. You do not touch the scroll with your fingers. You do not touch the Torah itself. People will kiss the Torah, like they'll kiss, a prayer shawl and touch it to the Torah. People will use a yad to read the Torah, but it's pure. It's the strongest expression of the Jewish religion, and it must not be touched. On the other hand, in Christianity, to stick to Abrahamic religions for a moment, you have communion. So the communion wafer, once it goes through transubstantiation and becomes, in the Catholic faith, the true body of Christ, you have to touch it. Part of taking communion is to ingest that communion wafer, to become one with it. And there are other examples, the black stone in the side of the Kaaba, once again, an Abrahamic religion, where you want to, if you can, on pilgrimage to Mecca, kiss that stone. That physical contact with the sacred becomes something that's very important in some communities and very important to avoid in others. Sacred places are the same thing. The sacred site of Mecca, Muslims must go. Non-Muslims are not allowed to go. It's forbidden. So who's allowed to touch something sacred? Who's not allowed to touch something sacred? The ideas of purity and impurity can be connected to those. In the article, I talk about two funerary rituals, one of the Zoroastrian folks who believe that a dead human body is something that's very, very polluting. If you were to bury a human body into a part of the earth, you wouldn't be able to plant there. You wouldn't be able to use that space anymore. What they do instead are sky burials, where a body is left to the elements, to animals, until it's reduced to bones. It's considered clean at that point and can be buried without causing pollution. On the other hand, it's no longer practiced, but the Wari people of the Amazon in Brazil used to practice a form of mortuary disposal of cannibalism because the idea of burying the dead was seen as so disrespectful to the body that you would place the body in the soil and let it decompose was awful. So the idea of ingesting the body kept it alive, kept it in people so that it was never going to decompose. And I talked in the article about what is polluting can be the body or the earth. And it just depends culturally on what people have been raised with, what they've been taught, what their beliefs are.
It's very, it's very interesting to see how variable beliefs can be, across the globe. Justin, I wanted to take a moment to narrow in a bit more. Can you explain the significance of the moon specifically in DNA culture?
Sure. So the Navajo Nation, like many other indigenous cultures within the United States, holds certain celestial bodies, including the moon, in a position of high reverence. For the Navajo people, the moon we call Olje or Tlehonnahe. And to us, the moon is a living deity, and it's often associated with the Navajo creation story, where we refer back to the holy people in Navajo cosmology. The moon is also the female counterpart to the sun, and we call the sun Johane, which is lighting up the night sky to, guide creatures. And the moon plays a similar role, being the light in the sky that guides creatures at night. She watches over the people of Earth, giving guidance and protection. But it's also incorporated into a lot of traditional practices and ceremonies that have existed since time immemorial. In different ceremonies such as the Hojonje, which is the blessing way ceremony for the Navajo people, or Kleje, which is the night way ceremony. And we also have the Nahatoje, which is the shooting way ceremony. Again, these ceremonies have been practiced for over 1,000 years and continue to be a part of our cultural identity and continue to play a important role in our life, especially during times of hardship. We'll take two instances within history. One is the Navajo Long Walk, when the Navajo people were rounded up by the U.S. government and forced to walk hundreds of miles from our Aboriginal territory to a military base in New Mexico. Along that walk, the Navajo would pray to the moon for strength and perseverance, and we survived Fort Sumner. And then, during World War II, when the Navajo was contributing to the war efforts in the Pacific Theater, helping securing a victory in World War II, we would also pray to the moon for protection to make sure that our people got home safely, and that we would actually continue our way of life. So the moon itself is really ingrained in our way of life, and we have the utmost respect. And I think that's why, a lot of Navajo, we've always been good stewards of lands, trying to protect and preserve their natural environment. And we also want to see that for our living deities in space.
Absolutely. And, in the US in particular, there's always been a distinction in policymaking between, the sacred or the spiritual and the secular. And that has been a cornerstone of policymaking in this nation. How do we extend that discussion into the exploration of space from your vantage point?
So, not to be the bearer of negativity, but I kind of want to reject the premise to that. To say that secular and the sacred have to be forever separated and that the sacred can't inform what we do as a secular society, I think is wrong. I don't think that's how America works. I don't think that's how America has ever worked. And I'll give you an example. The primary reason a lot of people oppose abortion in this country is because they think abortion is murder. Something you can try to make an argument out of it to justify it, but ultimately it's based on a belief about sacredness of life. If you ask most people why murder is wrong, they probably would respond in a way that says, God says it's wrong, or it goes against the Ten Commandments. And when we look at federal Indian policy, that's particularly true because what was the goal of the United States during westward expansion? There was a goal that was issued during the boarding school era, which was to kill the Indian to save the man. And those were where the policies of assimilation came in, to eradicate native culture, because they believed that the only way that you could, bring in an Indian savage to become a civilized man was to make them white. So it was a period of ethnic cleansing. So that's really how this country has operated for most of its history, despite the fact that tribes were here first. And we have a special designation written into the Constitution. Being a member of an Indian tribe is not a racial classification, it's a political classification. We're citizens of sovereign nations under the U.S. Constitution. We're recognized within international law. The federal government, really should be consulting with tribes before adopting policies that impact us. Protecting our sacred practices and beliefs is obviously going to be a top priority for a lot of indigenous cultures. And that's why I honestly think the U.S. has recognized that. And that's why Congress passed the Native American Religious Freedom Act. In that law, Congress specifically states and recognizes that It's the policy of the United States to protect religious beliefs of Native American tribes because tribes do have a special status. So even though our positions may be informed by our beliefs and what is sacred, that's okay, you know? But with that said, while most of US law is informed by core religious beliefs, by a majority of Americans, Native Americans alike, that's not to say that religion is dictating what the law is. I think we should all come together as a society of people with different backgrounds, different religions, different religious beliefs, to state these positions. We may have differing opinions, but at the end of the day, we're all trying to compromise, and that's what's important. We're all trying to come together and really resolve some of the differences that we have. And that's the true compromise. And that's why all the relevant parties need to be involved. That's why this discussion today is so important, because for the longest time, tribes have been left out of these discussions. And we're, trying to continue that practice here on Earth, but also take that practice with us beyond the stars, with, how we interact with Indigenous people, not just here in America, but as well as the international community. So we're hopeful that we'll be able to continue to take these practices with us as we talk about the regulation of space activities.
You touched a bit on the legal framework there, and for that, I got to tag Michelle in on this one. From a legal perspective, what are we allowed to do on the moon? What is the legal framework that currently exists, and what are the limitations that we currently have?
Thanks, Lauren. So first, Justin, that was incredible. Thank you. I don't think I've heard sort of any succinct and really thoughtful concept the way you put it together. And so I thank you for joining us. This was really moving and eye-opening to me. But it is a perfect segue, because we are at our humanity is at this incredible threshold, right? We're looking at expanding into space. We're doing it within a framework that was negotiated in the 1960s, okay? What was that framework concerned about? It was a disarmament treaty. All we cared about was not having war in space. And so we didn't think about people. We had, Article 1 says space is the province, the exploration and use of space are the province of all humankind, and you will explore and use space for the benefit and interests of all states. Interesting, right? Not all humans, all states. But you have this concept also of this freedom of exploration and use. When you get to space, you can do whatever you want in space. There was this general concept of, we don't want our sovereign boundaries to go to space. We have Article 2, which says nobody can claim territory in outer space. And we have this idea that, look, it's open there for everybody. Now, again, this is a state-centric treaty. And it is subject to a lot of interpretation. I don't know who first said it, but it was like, it's hard maybe to agree on words. It's really hard to agree on how to interpret those words. And that is our job right now, to interpret those words. And we need, when the Outer Space Treaty was negotiated, we were talking about 25 nations really sort of digging in and getting involved. That's not a very large population of humanity. And so again, I think, for example, the United States is doing a great job of trying to embrace more and more voices in this concept of space policy. The United Nations is doing a great job of encouraging more and more nations to contribute to the Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space, because we have to interpret things like, what does freedom of exploration and use mean? What is the province of all humankind? What limits are there on freedom of exploration and use, right? And we've just heard these competing ideas of what we should be able to do with something that we actually call in the treaty a celestial body. We don't call them planets and asteroids. We call them the moon and other celestial bodies. That feels really kind of special to me, right? So what limits do we have? Well, we have Article 4, which says you can't place weapons of mass destruction or nuclear weapons any place in space, and that the moon and other celestial bodies shall be used exclusively for peaceful purposes. Okay, so you can't start a war on the moon. So that's one limit. That's not limiting any commercial activities whatsoever, right? And then we have Article 3, which says international law applies in space. And so, one of the things we talk about is international human rights. The Declaration of Human Rights applies in space. Any declarations with respect to indigenous rights would apply to space. And as you very well said, when you open this, we don't lose our humanity when we go past the von Karman line. We don't lose that need to relate to each other. How does all this sort of hit, commercial entities? Well, we have Article 6, and so nations have to authorize and supervise their nationals and their activities in space. And what we do in our classes at Ole Miss, we look very carefully at that language, and it says you have to make sure that your companies are acting in conformity with the Outer Space Treaty. Now let's talk about interpreting the word conformity, right? What does that mean? So we really don't have a lot of boundaries in this legal framework. The last limit, the only other real limit, is Article 9, which says you will conduct your activities in outer space with due regard for the corresponding interests of other states. Okay, so again, we're not seeing corresponding interests of humans. We're not seeing necessarily, what does corresponding interest mean? Does that mean the interests of other people who are in space? In which case, the interests of indigenous communities who may not have an article or not be doing an activity in space don't even get impacted. So we really have to look at this Outer Space Treaty. It's an awesome treaty. Anyone who tells you we need to remove ourselves from everything it's bunk. It is an awesome framework. It's given us the tools with words like due regard that we just need to interpret. And when we interpret it, we need to embrace a lot of different perspectives. And this is coming from, our program at Mississippi is really focused on supporting commercial space, because we believe that commercial space is the way of the future, but we don't have to be irresponsible. And the Outer Space Treaty gives us the framework that allows us to figure out how to be responsible, although it doesn't have any sort of barriers on a lot of conduct at this point.
I mean, I love the job security of the questions of interpretation, and it's been a vast part of my study at the University of Mississippi and elsewhere. But I still can't believe that you managed to put the entire Outer Space Treaty in 90 seconds. So I can tell it's something you've practiced a couple times there. That's incredible. So Charlie, I've got to loop you in now. You're coming into this panel as the CEO of Celestis, a company that has been providing space burial services for going on 30 years. Why is this an industry that you felt passionate about? Why is this a venture that you really took on? I know you touched on it a bit, but expand a little bit more.
Well, I'm passionate about it because I see people's reactions moving through a grief cycle to literally a celebration and the fulfillment of their loved ones' life dreams of going into space. That gives all of us a feeling that is really hard to describe and duplicate. We've got thousands of people from around the world, from all faiths, from several cultures, who choose this as their memorial service for their mom, their brother, their father, and just being a part of that process is really what motivates me more than anything else. I love the fact that it brings it coincides with my personal commitment to help humanity move throughout the solar system. And as we move throughout the solar system, we're going to take all of our rituals, all of our celebrations, all of our memorials with us. People will pass away in outer space and on the moon and in various locations. So giving people that joy is what we're all about.
And when we talk about the concept of a space burial, we're not necessarily meaning we're sending an entire human into space or onto the moon, right? Can you explain a little bit more about what Celestis' services entail? That process?
Sure, it's a good question, and that's why we call it a memorial space flight, not a space burial. So what we do is we fly a very small portion, a symbolic portion of cremated remains or a DNA sample of people in a tiny, there are 3 of them here if you can see them, flight capsule, which is thoroughly engineered and tested for vacuum and temperature and secure closure and flight proven. Into space with a return into Earth orbit, to the moon, and to deep space. Our capsules are always placed So capsules is point number one, individual flight capsules. Nothing, cremated remains or DNA samples in our service are never scattered anywhere. They're always flying inside a separate container on a spacecraft that is already headed for a specific location. In the case of the moon, it's a lunar-bound spacecraft launched to a specific landing location, where upon landing they remain permanently. They're not dispersed, released, or otherwise scattered onto the lunar surface. So it's really more like flying a container and never releasing it. Our capsules do, however, play a very important role in the spacecraft. They're used for ballast and radiation protection, giving the spacecraft that use our participants potentially longer lifetime. And all of this is in keeping with our founding philosophy of we contribute net nothing to the actual space environment for every one of our services. The Earth orbital missions stay attached to a spacecraft that burns up in its entirety upon re-entering the Earth. The lunar spacecraft, as I said, stay attached to a lander and they're not dispersed forever. So I wanted to describe that specific aspect of our service. Obviously, families come to the launch site, celebrate the launch, celebrate the fulfillment of a loved one's dreams, and meet people from around the world. We'll have 650 guests at a launch from upwards of 30 countries. So that's the service in sort of in a nutshell. We go to several destinations.
You know, we're obviously here on this panel today and have the number of viewers that we do because this is an important issue and also one that is rife with differing viewpoints. I want to take a moment to loop all of you into a question that I received from one of our viewers about the concept of being open to compromise that Justin had mentioned during his question just a few moments ago. You know, what might that compromise look like if, you know, on one hand, you recognize the legitimacy of other faiths, and if some of those other faiths view the moon and its sacredness differently? You know, what might that look like?
Well, since nobody's jumping in,
I'll jump in at one.
I was going to mention this if I had an opportunity. I was chatting with my son yesterday. He's 15. And one of the thoughts he had was Celestis sends different, they send symbolic portions of cremated remains on a number of different missions. But he wondered if the Navajo Nation would be comfortable with cremains or cremated remains sent into lunar orbit, where they would orbit the moon. There are orbiters right now, but not actually touch the moon's surface, whether that would be something that would be more acceptable. So I'll throw that out there. My son, Luke, he gets credit for that.
So from the Navajo Nation's perspective, we're not crazy about things going into space. We don't outright oppose it. I think what we're really worried about is protecting the celestial body itself and preventing it from what we would consider a graveyard, or turning it into a landfill, because a lot of the equipment that we send up to the moon can't be retrieved. And it would take a massive effort to retrieve a lot of this stuff. The moon for us, obviously very sacred, but we have to think about the environmental consequences. There's only one moon, and the moon is very important to life here on Earth. It regulates ocean tides. It plays a vital role, again, not just from a spiritual or religious aspect, but just from an ecosystem aspect. And if something happens to the moon, what does that mean for human life on Earth? And that's just, the Navajo perspective, and many tribal nations may have the same perspective, but, when it comes to launching things into space and whatnot, we obviously can't. I mean, people are going to do it. but what we can do from, us being stewards of our celestial bodies and being stewards of our sacred sites is at least engage in a conversation with the government to really figure out what is the best way to come to a compromise on these discussions. I don't have an answer today. And this is why I think it's important to have these discussions, because people are probably, if the US doesn't do it, other countries may do it. And this is why we're seeking to spark an international discussion on what some of the responsible activities are for outer space.
I think there's a
Just jump in. Oh.
conflation of respectful disposition of human remains and somehow garbage, or I've heard the term desecration. There's at least 10 major religions that consider the earth as sacred, but yet Americans are scattering remains at national parks. Hindus are scattering ashes on the Ganges. We bury our honored dead at sea. We don't consider that as desecrating the planet in any way. We are honoring the dead. So I think we need to, as we speak compromise, which who isn't open to that, we need to have a couple of things in mind. It can't be a compromise to say, essentially, from our religious point of view, our 600,000 person, whatever group, we claim the right to prohibit all other religious activities on the moon. That can't be a compromise. And that's our only standard. All of our clients worship the moon and want to be there and view that as a holy experience. How do they not have the right? They aren't claiming that the entire moon is ours and no one can practice any other sort of religion, or taking that to the federal government and making that claim. The religious freedom is grand. We formed the country based on that, but it stops at the point where it becomes religious dictation. And that's the only real concern that I have with anything that's being said, is that we know that, first of all, we know that there already are remains on the moon. NASA led that charge in 1999 by honoring Gene Shoemaker on the moon. As I said earlier, you guys, Beyond Earth, are all about habitation. So in 25 years, maybe there's 100 people living and working on the moon. In 50 years, maybe 1,000. Are we going to say that you cannot, and people will die there? Are you going to say that all those people, what do you do with that? How do you not handle a dead body? How do you not meet someone's request for, hey, I want to be buried here in a niche on the moon? So there's really not a realistic, if you believe in an expansive human future in space, there's not a realistic way to say one can't do this on an entire celestial body. And that's our only concern. Again, we have tiny amounts of stuff that's going there anywhere. So we're not trashing the moon. We're not. And I think we heard a little bit ago that the real objection is, should we be going to space at all? And I think that may well be a fundamental question. But some of that is, I have a difficult time saying, great, we'll compromise and say no activity on the moon along the lines that we do, which has, by the way, been validated under international and national law now 4 times. FAA licenses, NASA action, what have you. So it clearly is a legal function. Then that's not the discussion today, but morality sometimes comes out of legality as well.
Miss Shelley,
And just jump in and
jump in.
move it. move it beyond. So I'm not going to talk about sacredness. I'm going to talk about responsibility. First of all, who was making the decisions? You Charles, are talking about 650 people who love the moon and who have some sort of special bond with it. Well, what do we do if a dictator wants their ashes sent to the moon? Do we want to memorialize like Mao Zedong?
No,
Vladimir
we're a
Putin?
private company,
But
so we can choose not to.
Yeah, but somebody else can, right? So
Yeah.
you're the one making decisions about who's going to the moon. And
Right.
I don't know that that's correct. I also think, and again, I want to take it away from sacred and just talk about all of these missions that are going to the moon right now. When India announced that it was going to land on the lunar South Pole or near it, Russia said, "Oh, yeah, we're going to do it too." So and they crash landed on the moon. So we're essentially just sending stuff to the moon because we can. Is that really the right attitude to have towards our moon right now? And sure, you talk about leaving these things on the landers, but what happens to the landers? We're talking about 30, 40, 50 landers. Do they all just sit there on the moon forever and ever? Are you really saying that once that lander's there on the lunar South Pole, on a very valuable acreage of the moon, you can't move it because there are, cremations on there, or you can't move it because it's a lander? I mean, what if we need to really think about recycling on the moon? And I am about heritage protection, right? I don't want to see the boot prints erased. I don't think the Apollo lunar lander should be recycled. But I do think we are reaching the point where we have to decide everything that we send to the moon needs to be able to be recycled. And we need to, I'm not a fan of the lunar orbiter either, because that requires propulsion, and that's going to get pulled down into the lunar orbit, and we're not going to know where it lands when it does fall into the lunar orbit. So I think, we really need to, this isn't about religion. It is for some, but for me, it's about responsibility and what we're doing to our moon and how we're going to figure out what gets put where on the moon. And one thought I have been apprised of is creating an actual burial site on the moon, or cremation site on the moon. Send everything to one place, and then maybe that would be, we just send everything there. And make it an international agreement. And I will also, I don't think this has been internationally agreed to, that it's okay to send cremations to the moon. It's been agreed in the United States that it's not illegal to do so under the Outer Space Treaty. But again, I don't think we've had, a vote at the COPUOS about whether this is something that the Outer Space Treaty ought to allow.
Well, and I want to just quickly jump in. There was a mention that, people scatter their ashes at national parks in the U.S. That's illegal. You cannot do that.
No, it's legal. No.
It absolutely.
You're wrong.
I mean, if we want to look at appropriate models on what you're allowed to do, Antarctica is a wonderful example of this.
I was just going to say that.
I mean, it's officially against the IAATO's rules to spread remains in Antarctica, because nobody has a claim to it. Nobody has a right to take over Antarctica, but we use it purely for scientific exploration. And the Navajo Nation has never opposed the scientific exploration of space or the space activities. What we're really focused on is preserving the sacredness and the environment of our celestial bodies. And that's really what the Navajo Nation is. And these are decisions that are being made without input from tribal nations. And that's what we're trying to focus is we want tribes at the table. There is an international law, the United Declaration of Indigenous Rights for Indigenous People, that sets the international foundation that tribes need to be consulted on decisions that are going to impact them. And whether that's going to be impacting their lands or the way that they practice, their cultural beliefs and heritage. I think this is just a broader discussion that and we're not going to solve all the issues today, but, I don't see, humanity is not ending tomorrow. It's not ending, the day after. If anyone knows of an asteroid, coming towards Earth right now, let me know. My position might change, but we shouldn't rush these types of decisions. I think there needs to be a substantive discussion on how we move forward.
May I respond?
I wanted to jump in really quick with a couple things. One, I wanted to follow up with what Justin was saying and ask Michelle how much of the rules about disposal of the dead in Antarctica can apply, because I was looking at that as well. And I just wanted to point out too, if we're talking about settlements where people are dying on the moon, there's no decomposition, right? So if you were to take an entire body and put it in a crevice or something, you could come back in years and it would still be there. So it's a similar situation with below freezing locations like Antarctica, where there are rules that have a lot to do with the environment of the place where people would be dying. So legally, is there a way to carry something over from another international territory that's not permanently inhabited? There we go. That's the word.
I mean, we can always look to other models. The problem with it's not a problem. The Antarctica Treaty is a very nice model. It does not permit mining. And if we are going to support human communities on the lunar surface, we are going to have to use the resources that are there in situ. So I do think, that we do have models on Earth that we can borrow from, but we are, like I said, as I opened my remarks, we are on this incredible threshold. And I agree with Justin, we're not going to solve the problem today, but what we want to make sure, and hopefully that what comes out of today, is that we get more and more voices into the conversation about how we're going to solve these problems.
Let me pause you right there. Thank you, Michelle, for that concise explanation of very complicated legal framework there. As Steve mentioned in his introduction, we do have Frank White joining us from the Overview Roundtable, and I do want to invite him now to share a few of his thoughts on the topic.
Great. Thank you so much, everybody. I'm going to try to keep this brief, but it's going to be difficult. What an exciting and important conversation this is. So the Overview Roundtable is a project of the Human Space Program, and we're really happy to be here today. We consider Beyond Earth to be a sister organization. We're going to work together more frequently. And our mission is a sustainable, inclusive, and ethical evolution of humanity into the solar ecosystem. And so this is really relevant. I think one thing I have to do is say my mantra that I say every time. We are in space. We've always been in space. We'll always be in space. So I always think of the Earth as the first space community. And what we learn here as human beings is inevitably going to be transferred into new space communities. We're not really going into space. We're really leaving planet Earth and creating new space communities. And we want to learn from what we've learned here and avoid the problems we've created here. And that's what I keep hearing in the conversation today. And I do actually have a proposal or an idea I wanted to share with you. I do have to say, I've been a consultant to Celestis. I wrote an article about the joy and euphoria people feel when they launch their loved ones. And many years ago, Justin, I attended a conference of indigenous and Western scientists. And one of the speakers from the Hopi Nation said the worst thing that ever happened in history was bringing back rocks from the moon. And that opened my eyes to other approaches because I was a big Apollo fan. And I thought, wow, people don't have the same attitude I do. And that was just the beginning of my sensitivity to what you're talking about. What I'd like to talk about is something we do all the time on Earth because we have a lot of conflict on Earth. And that is going back to compromise, which is mediation. I would like to see the Human Space Program lead the way in creating a mediation service for these kinds of conflicts. I don't know that we really have a place to go with this kind of disagreement. And I've talked to Michelle about it, and I don't want to speak for her, but I think whenever there's something legal or ethical, I ask her what we should do. I think she sees this as a pretty good idea. I've talked to Steve Wolf about it. And it just seems to me, I experienced mediation when I got a divorce, a personal thing. It avoided a huge fight in the courts. Nobody was going to win but the lawyers. And my family won. My wife and I were not going to stay together or agree. And we just moved past finger pointing and disagreement. And the mediator helped us come to some sort of conclusion. I don't know how all of you would feel about this, but we've been talking a lot at the roundtable about this issue of remains on the moon and the Navajo Nation's objection. And it just popped into my mind, well, this is going to come up again and again and again off the planet. As I said, not in space, but off the planet. And we've learned a lot. We know mediation works. And so I just want to leave it there because I know we're getting close to the end of the time. And I thank you and Steve for letting me just raise this issue, and would love to hear from all of you whenever you have a chance, if you think this is a good idea and maybe your organization could get behind it.
Thank you so much, Frank, for your thoughts. I invite our panelists to share any reactions that they may have to Frank's suggestions.
I mean, what Frank suggested was, what we've been asking for. We need to be included in a discussion, and it needs to involve all stakeholders. Us as Indian people, again, we have a special classification. We're American citizens, but we're not the average normal American citizens. We are protected by rights listed in the Constitution, but we also have tribal law that we take into account, and that's been the framework for U.S. federal Indian policy for a long time now. And while these intentions are good, it all goes back to everything that we discussed. If we choose to allow these memorial space flights or moon burials or whatever you want to call it, it's as motivated by spiritual beliefs as our objections are. Does that mean that Celestis' position is invalid and shouldn't be considered? No, absolutely not. It just means that we have to do our best to come up with a system that works as much for society as possible, taking in all opinions and all accounts. But I also want to add that while intention matters, the presence of good intentions doesn't necessarily justify anything and everything. If we go back into history, the original Spanish missionaries who came to the Southwest may have had the best intentions in spreading Christianity, but that didn't justify what they did. It was a common practice for them to build churches on top of kivas, which are sacred ceremonial spaces of the pueblos. And that construction is considered desecration to kivas, and it contributed to a decline of traditional Native practices and the beliefs in many communities. But the missionaries may argue that it was to build churches where people could praise God. Both are true, but missionaries could have also just built their churches elsewhere or did something different. So intentions only get them so far. And I share that to also share that as we look at the entire framework of what we're trying to lead towards, we have to look at what the intention is. If the intention, I'm not trying to be disrespectful or anything, but Celestis just kind of indicated that they get to choose who gets to go into space, and they can deny specific people. So with that mindset, I'm not saying Celestis is going to do this, but say that there is only one company that only sends Christians to the moon, or there's a company that only sends one specific faith or practice, and putting those interests of a very few over the interest of millions of people, across the globe. So that's, I guess, what we're kind of trying to highlight is we really want a substantive discussion on what the, peaceful and respectful responsibility activities of space activity, but we need to have tribes as part of the discussion.
To respond to Frank's comments, very thoughtful comments, and I am deeply supportive of the idea, the concept of mediation. What the problem, though, in this case, and in many cases that we're going to see in the next 5, 10, 15 years, is that the law says freedom of exploration and use. There's no reason to go to mitigation when you can do anything you want in space. And so it's really, we see in the Artemis Accords this concept trying to draw up the concept of due regard and figure out what due regard means. And, the Artemis Accords are adopting this sort of notification and coordination zone. But it's those kinds of steps we need to take to see, okay, what are we mediating over? Because again, right now, freedom of exploration and use, Celestis is not breaking the law. It is not doing anything illegal. Absolutely not. Should it be? I don't know. This, again, that's not for me to decide. It's for humanity to decide, I think. That there's a lot more to understanding what freedom of exploration and use means and what due regard means than just cremains. There's a lot of other things we need to take into consideration. And I think, this is a particular flashpoint for many reasons. But again, I really urge everybody to think about, people are sending, strands of hair, DNA, a lot of stuff is getting sent to the moon. If you can afford to do it, great. But, if there's 7-8 billion people on Earth, and if everybody sent their crap to the moon, then all of a sudden we have just a big, huge junk pile on the moon. Where does it stop?
So, my turn. I don't know where to start. First, I don't make the decision whether we fly or not. There are national regulations that require us to submit to a process that looks at, do we violate public safety? Do we violate national security? Do we violate international agreements? Every time we fly, the answer is you do not do that. I don't make those decisions. We have a Congress that passed the first law about that in 1982. So I wanted to say that. Secondly, yes, having a competitive free market is a major driver, potentially, of human expansion into space. And we should encourage that within the laws that are extant. If we need to pass new laws, then this new law we're talking about is going to say, based on a religious test, you may not fly. That's really, yes, I'm all open to conversation, but it wasn't me that went to the White House and tried to stop my launch because we had ashes aboard. That's fact. So in point of fact, great to have a discussion. Wrong to say religious test for space payloads. And all the other discussions about mining in Antarctica are missing the simple, what drove this meeting, which is, are we allowed under law and even ethically to pursue our business in a non-national, threatening, all of those things that we must pass in order to do that. So and by the way, I think, again, why is sending capsules of ashes crap when it's honored dead on Earth? We honor our deceased. We have rituals. We don't call it crap when we do that. We say our loved one has now joined the wind. Our loved one has become a tree. Our loved one is an artificial reef, and what a wonderful tribute to him. I take umbrage at that characterization. And yes, people will be traveling to space, and we will be taking, I hope, I believe, if we aren't taking our rituals and memorial services with us, we aren't going to go very far. So it's really a question of, do we allow a single religious interpretation to dictate what flies into space? And if we do, how about the Hindus? How about the Rastas? How about the Christians who sign up with us? How about the people that don't have a faith other than I want to join the sky? Where are their rights? Where are their traditional support? Those folks have an equal claim on a memorial service as long as it's done responsibly. And we're nothing after 30 years if not responsible. And we will continue to be, and there are laws about, oh, it's like you can only serve people in a restaurant. You can't only serve people in certain areas. So I suspect that there'll always be a diversity of people on our flights. We've never had to say no to anyone. I doubt that a foreign dictator coming to Celestis is going to happen in the near term, nor do I believe it should drive a policy that says, therefore, you can't do this. You can't create, we were lauded when we first started as the first viable commercial space activity. Space News, all of these other things recognize the groundbreaking nature and the economic driver that's so important in space development. So let's not lose sight of the fact that our people are equal celebrants, are equally faithful, are doing something that they believe is totally in consonant with their beliefs and their morals, and say, well, no, y'all can't do that because we have this other group that says the entire planetary celestial body known as the moon is off limits because of our religious belief. When we start going down that road and start subjecting our space missions to religious tests, other nations will pass us by very quickly.
Justin, I'd love to hear your thoughts on some of what's just been said.
Well, I'm going to go back to my initial statement. I mean, who are we prioritizing? I mean, it sounds like it's only the few that can afford it. But it's also, this practice of space burial and lunar burials or space memorials is fairly new. It's only been around for 30 years, and every time that it has touched a celestial body, Navajo Nation has objected. We objected in the 90s and we object today. But are we really going to disregard, and I'm not aware of any religion today, and maybe Dana, you can chime in here, of a religion that says you should send your loved ones to a celestial body as part of a memory. Now, I'm not trying to be disrespectful, but a lot of the discussions that we're having today is a want and a desire for closure. But it's not an actual something that has been practiced for a long time. So, I mean, I'd like to hear Deanna's thoughts. Should 30 years take precedence over something that's been around for thousands of years?
Oh, yeah, I can talk about that. One of the things that's really important to keep in mind is that culture is incredibly fluid and religion is incredibly fluid. Every religion that has a long tradition today started somewhere, and we always adapt to new circumstances. Religions adapt to cultural contact, right? People in the Navajo Nation know that a long history interacting with Christians has changed the beliefs and practices to some extent. Christianity has changed depending on where the location is. I've talked to astronauts who've practiced Christian rituals in space, and they're very different when you're in microgravity. I've talked to astronauts who've practiced meditation in space, and microgravity meditation is incredibly different. When humanity goes out, think about the number of religions that see the moon as a calendar, right? Judaism, Islam, Ramadan just started. What is that going to look like when Muslims are on Mars, right? And are Phobos and Deimos going to be the new way of doing that, or are they going to stick to the lunar calendar? So the first thing I want to say is, although religions do try to maintain their traditions, they always shift, they always change, they're always in flux. That doesn't mean, however, that something that is brand new is necessarily going to be recognized as something legitimate. I was just talking about Mormon Christianity in my class today, and the fact that that started in the 1800s strikes a lot of people as incredibly suspicious. It doesn't count because it's new, and that happens a lot. It's going to be one of these things where I think a lot of Michelle's points were really good. The laws do need to adapt to cultural changes. Nothing that we did in the 1960s is going to make sense in the 2030s. Some of it might, but we need to, like, the fact that this is a debate that's going on right now means that there needs to be a response to this. This shows that we need to have guidance. And so I think mediation, as Frank was saying, is a really good idea to start putting that guidance together. I think we want to talk to as wide a group of people as possible. I've done research into Celestis. I've talked to people who sent loved ones into space. I know how important that was for them. And I know that it's something that was kind of a dream that never was possible before. And now it is. That has to be taken into account. I guess the point that I'm saying or getting to is that we do have to recognize that all of this is fluid. All of this can be shaped, and all of this can shape policy, and to be as inclusive as possible while we do it. I understand Charlie's points. This is something that's very meaningful for the people involved. I do think, though, that the more voices can be heard and brought together to create policy, the better this is going to be. And I think that respect overall in all directions needs to be at the forefront.
Please let me briefly respond to Justin's question about are there any religions that endorse this. We were fortunate to be blessed by Zachone Rinpoche, the founder of the Imahu Foundation of Phoenix, a Tibetan Buddhist teaching center, who reported that there were 20,000 monks in Tibet praying for our mission to the moon. So yes, other religions embrace it. Yours does not. That's cool. As I said, we can't just select a single religion and say our space policy is based on that.
And well, I want to, really just make the distinction. Navajo culture is just one culture. We have over 574 federally recognized sovereign nations within the U.S. A large portion of them may not also agree. I can't speak for them, but we're just one people. We're just one people. But there's no specific formula, and you're right. There's no specific formula that should govern. But what I want to say is, in times of need and poverty, we prioritize feeding families over the environment, but that doesn't mean that the environment doesn't matter, right? Food is required to sustain life, but culture is what makes life worth living, and it makes us human. That's why as we grow richer as a society, we have the luxury to worry about things like art and music, and we spend more time protecting and preserving things like the environment and our history and our language. And don't even get me started on the need to preserve, indigenous languages. That's a whole nother topic that I'm happy to discuss. But I guess what I'm really trying to say is that space travel at this point in time is a luxury. I mean, it's still going to be there tomorrow. But again, talk to me again if there's an asteroid plummeting towards Earth, because we might have to change our position. But for now, I think we can afford to take the time to really figure things out. And there's a lot of scientific breakthroughs that come from early space missions, and I assume that there are going to be more to come, and we don't need to rush it. And again, Navajo is not opposed to the exploration, everything like that. We have Navajos who work at NASA, who work in engineering. We have Aaron Yazzie, who works on the Mars rover. We have students who are engaged at MIT because they're excited about the next step in space exploration and space activities. What we're just really asking for is take this discussion, incorporate the tribal voices, and us as Navajo, we are just one tribe. We are just one group of people. There are 574 other federally recognized sovereign nations within the United States, that doesn't even account for the state recognized tribes. And then you have the international community where there are also indigenous people across the globe, and that's where the UNDRIP comes in. So I guess really that's what we're focused on. And again, let me know if there's an asteroid coming, because our position very well could change.
Well, that's the point. Space travel, in my view, is not a luxury. It's an evolutionary necessity. We do have the support of other tribes in the nations. The Zia tribe in New Mexico lent us, at our request, their logo for one of our memorial space flights. We support an organization called Taking Up Space that sends sixth grade Native American women to space camp. We did that long before controversies. So it's a blanket of people and cultures and beliefs and motivations. And it's always easier to say, let's talk about it. We're dealing with saying, okay, but deny everyone their rights while we talk about it, which I don't think is the right solution. I'm more than willing to engage anywhere, anytime, happily in conversations. Just don't start from the standpoint of running to the White House and trying to stop a launch 1 week before it happens. That's not conversation, that's action. And we have, as we have not focused at all, but we have every legal right to conduct our business. We have every moral right to serve the thousands of people we're already serving and the millions of people around the world who identify with space. Let's not stop that while we try to find a path to work with you. And that's my only point.
As we enter this kind of end period, as we're, nearing the end of our time here together, I do want to open the space to the four of you to offer any last words, any final thoughts, anything that you want to leave us with as we move forward in this discussion. Obviously, our goal here was never to solve these issues, but to sit down and have the talks that need to be had. And as we wrap up, I do want to thank you again for sitting down and having these hard discussions. It's incredibly important to have them and to open these spaces to ensure that there is a culturally and spiritually diverse future in space. So with that, I want to give you all just a couple seconds to say any last thoughts, anything that you'd like to leave this audience with before I turn it over to Steve. Anyone?
I'll just jump in real quick and say, spirituality is part of humanity. Humans in space mean religious issues in space. This isn't something that we can just say, oh, well, this is science and we can just not worry about it. I think it really is. I think this is really illustrating that this is something we do need to talk about. So I'm really glad that we have been, and I hope this continues.
Thank you.
Well, I'll add that, again, it's perfectly legal. You can send whatever you want to the moon. Literally, you can send tardigrades, you can send advertisements, you can do anything you want on the moon. And that includes erase the boot prints of Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin. There are a lot of things that are permissible by law that I don't think should be. And so I think one thing we need to think about, and again, this doesn't mean that I support not allowing remains on the moon or anything like that, but we really need to start putting some boundaries on the things that we can do on the moon. I personally believe the moon is something special. The moon is finite. It's not an infinite resource. We do have infinite resources in space. We need to use the moon to learn how to access them. But we also have to be mindful that, we've so many lessons from Earth about running into things and messing them up. And so can we, I don't want to put the brakes on, but can we just start talking about putting up some boundaries? And like I said, the Artemis Accords have already started that with the teasing out, and my one small step back, teasing out the concept of due regard and figuring out what that actually means. Thank you.
Charlie, Justin, any last words for us?
I've spoken at length, and I think I appreciate Beyond Earth. I appreciate and respect all of the panelists. If anything, we like to characterize ourselves as appealing to all nations and all people, and we'll continue with that commitment as we continue to provide this service that now has put more people in space than all the governments of the world combined. And we welcome discussion. We want to support everyone right to practice the end of life rituals that are meaningful to them.
Thank you. Justin, any last words for us?
I've also spoken a lot, but if you've ever known a Navajo, we love to talk. So, but I think overall, again, I appreciate the discussion, and that's what we wanted from the start. And with, our opposition and whatnot, we may not agree on everything, but we just appreciate the opportunity to be brought to the table to have these discussions. And, I just want to clarify, the reason we ran to the White House is because we are a political classification, and the federal government made promises to us, and we're trying to uphold those promises. We didn't outright ban the launch. We just asked for, hey, hold it off for a few days. Let's talk this through. But the launch happened. If you believe in divine intervention, just kidding. But overall, we just want to say we appreciate being brought to the table, and we hope that we're at the table as we continue developing the framework of what will be a permanent use of outer space.
Well, on behalf of Beyond Earth and also on behalf of me, I am enormously grateful to all of you for taking the time out of your day to be here and to have this discussion. I'd like to turn it over to Steve for some final words, and thank you again all for being here.
That was really an extraordinary program. Thank you all. Thank you, Charlie. Thank you, Michelle. Thank you, Justin and Dina. And especially our moderator, Lauren Andrade. It does make me realize that as we look at the sacredness of space and life, I mean, it really is a human activity, right? It's not, even if you're an atheist, there are things about the world and about traditions that we hold sacred. We have done that throughout human history, and we're going to continue to do that as we expand out into space. As we work through the nuances of various cultures and various differences, I know we'll get through that. And as long as we do that in a way that was as respectful as we have done during this program. I do want to, before we leave, actually, can you put Lauren in the call back in the spotlight again? Yeah. And I do want to invite, before we send off, I do want to invite our Beyond Earth Executive Vice President, Courtney Stad, to join us for a few comments as well on this important topic.
Yeah, I'll make it very short. It is a fraught topic, and with that in mind, I want to thank everybody for participating. And Lauren, you did not disappoint. Just really a fabulous job of managing an issue that's multifaceted. Facts count, so I wanted to make sure, even though we are neutral on this, but in the chat room, there was a reference made to the national parks not allowing ashes. I put in there, in fact, it is permitted. Use of a permit does allow for ashes to be circulated in the parks. I just want to make sure that fact was known. I also want to indicate that for many of us, and for me, I look at cremains, and I'll be honest, I've actually signed up for it as a fulfillment of a a theology and a philosophy of my own. So for me, it's not a luxury. It's actually an extension and an opportunity. And believe me, I am the opposite of a rich person. And it's an extraordinarily affordable opportunity, and it's being made available through one of the biggest, funeral homes in the country. Having said that, absolutely respect where Justin's coming from, but I do think that we have to be careful. We're a country that's great because of its plurality and diversity, and I think we need to respect the ability to navigate, not in a way that gets caught up in a protracted bureaucratic debate for years to come, but in a way that helps address the various competing matters. And in fact, one thing I wanted to say, I thought that Michelle's reference to a designated burial site on the moon was one that hopefully might be considered. So again, want to thank everybody for your participation and look forward to follow up to this in the months to come. So thank you.
Thanks, Courtney. And again, I think if attendance of a program like this is any indication, percentages count. We had almost 125 folks register for this event, and over 100 attended. Now, for a free webinar, as most people, as folks should know, if you get 50%, you're good. So we have really exceeded our expectations there. We want to continue this conversation along with all the other important conversations that Beyond Earth is driving as we move towards a future for humans to live and work and eventually migrate into space. So again, thanks, Lauren. Thank you, Courtney. Thanks again to our panelists. Thanks to the audience. We'll see you next time. Thanks again. Have a great day.
Beyond Earth is committed to the true purpose of why we go to space. Join us on this journey.